world for Mark Downey was a brutal, uncomplicated place. 40 years old, with the lean, wire-tight frame of a man who had seen too many sunrises from a foxhole and too many sunsets from the wrong end of a battlefield, he had cultivated a reputation. Not for heroism, not for kindness, but for competence. He was, in certain circles, known as a problem solver. A man who dealt in the messy, the unspeakable, the things that kept others awake at night. He lived in the kind of solitude that tasted of pine resin and old gun oil, a quiet existence punctuated by the stark reality of the natural world and the occasional unsettling summons from the human one. Take, for instance, the incident a few years back in the foothills of Colorado. A grizzly bear gone rogue had been tearing through livestock, even making a run at a couple of campers. The local wildlife services, bound by regulations and public outcry, had been hamstrung. They needed someone who could operate beyond the usual protocols. That's where Mark came in. He hadn't sought glory or a particularly difficult challenge. He'd seen a clear problem and a clear solution. He spent 3 days tracking the beast, moving through the aspens and high country pines with the silent efficiency of a shadow. When he finally found it, a hulking male with a scarred muzzle and eyes that held a malevolent glint, it was tearing into the carcass of a bull elk, its massive claws shredding muscle and bone. Mark hadn't hesitated. A single well-placed shot from his custom rifle, a job with a laminated stock and a scope that held its zero better than some men held their promises, dropped the bear instantly. No theatrics, no prolonged struggle, just the thump of a colossal body hitting the forest floor and the sudden, unsettling silence that followed. It was a testament to his pragmatism, his cold-blooded professionalism, the kind of work that left a man feeling hollowed out, but undeniably effective. His gear, laid out in the back of his pickup truck, told its own story. A worn leather sheath holding a hunting knife with a razor edge, a canvas roll containing an assortment of precision tools, a battered but meticulously maintained rifle case, and a pair of scuffed hiking boots that had walked more miles than most men drive in a lifetime. Everything functional, nothing flashy. Each item a silent witness to a life lived on the fringes of civilization, where survival often hinged on a steady hand and an unblinking gaze. The call came on a Tuesday late afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the ragged peaks of the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. Mark was cleaning the action of his rifle, the metallic click and snap a comforting rhythm in the quiet of his cabin. The phone, an old satellite model he kept for emergencies, buzzed with an unfamiliar number. He answered with a grunt. The voice on the other end was clipped, cautious, but held an insistent edge. It belonged to a man he'd never met, a shadow of a shadow, a conduit in the murky world he inhabited. "Mr. Downey," the voice began, "I have an opportunity for you. East Coast. Remote corner of Maine." The offer was vague, couched in euphemisms. Elimination of a large predator. Local authorities are overwhelmed. Mark's brow furrowed. He asked for details, specifics about the target, the scope of the problem. The voice grew evasive, citing client confidentiality and the delicate nature of the situation. His suspicions immediately flared. Something wasn't right. But then the number was mentioned. A truly generous sum, with half up front, wired within the hour. It was an amount that made even Mark, a man not easily swayed by material things, pause. He considered the long stretches of quiet he'd been craving, the lure of easy money, and the undeniable itch of a new challenge. He took the job. The journey was a blur of highway miles that gradually gave way to secondary roads, then to gravel tracks that seemed to unravel into the very fabric of the landscape. His old pickup, a large diesel truck modified for long expeditions with extra fuel tanks and a reinforced suspension, ate up the distance. He watched the familiar rugged beauty of the New England states give way to the raw, untamed wilderness of Maine. The forests here were different, denser, older, with ancient pines that clawed at the sky and shadowed wetlands that exuded a perpetual damp chill. The air grew heavy with the scent of pine needles, wet earth, and something else, something wild and untamed. He passed through settlements that looked like shadows of communities, forgotten places clinging to existence by a thread, their painted signs peeling, their windows dark and hollow. The farther north he drove, the more pronounced the sense of isolation became. It wasn't just physical distance. It was a profound detachment from the rhythm of civilization, a slow, creeping realization that he was heading into a place where the rules were different, where the wilderness held sway. The trees, thick as a wall, pressed in on either side of the narrow road, like silent sentinels watching his deliberate progress. The sun, when it broke through, dappled the road in shifting patterns, making the landscape seem alive with unseen movement. Finally, after hours of bone-jarring travel, he arrived at a designated waypoint, a turnoff marked only by a faded red ribbon tied to a spruce branch. Waiting there, parked beside a rusting mailbox, was an older model sedan, its paint dulled by years of sun and rain. A man detached himself from the shadows of the vehicle as Mark pulled up. He was thin, nervy, with eyes that darted constantly, refusing to meet Mark's direct gaze. This was the local intermediary, a man who had spent his entire life looking over his shoulder. His description of the problem was brief, disjointed, delivered in a low, panicked whisper. Something huge, incomprehensibly cruel. He spoke of the Harper farm, about 3 miles deeper into the woods, the site of the latest incident. Mark, his face unreadable, simply nodded. He drove the remaining distance, the sense of dread tightening in his gut. The Harper farm was a picture of bucolic ruin. The farmhouse itself stood silent, windows dark, but it was the barn and the surrounding pastures that told the true horror. Mark stepped out of his truck, the engine cooling with a series of metallic clicks. The air here was heavy with a cloying, sickly sweet smell that was both metallic and organic, a smell he knew intimately, the scent of fresh blood, fear, and death. It was worse than anything he'd encountered in Colorado. The sight that greeted him in the Harper's pasture was truly shocking. Cows and sheep, dozens of them, lay sprawled in grotesque tableau of violence. Their bodies were not merely killed. They were torn, ripped apart with a brutal, almost surgical precision that defied the capabilities of any ordinary predator. Limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, flanks shredded, entrails spilled onto the dew-kissed grass. It wasn't just a massacre. It was a statement. Mark, a man hardened by unimaginable horrors, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just a big cat or a rogue bear. This was something else entirely, something with a malice he hadn't encountered before. He moved through the gruesome scene with practiced calm, his senses alert, cataloging every detail. The ground, still soft from a recent rain, held an array of tracks, he crouched, his gloved fingers tracing the impressions. They were immense, larger than any grisly print he'd ever seen. Yet the shape was all wrong. Not the splayed, powerful paw of a bear, nor the compact feline pad of a mountain lion. These prints were elongated with distinct, sharp claws and a strange, almost human-like heel. What truly unsettled him was the depth, impossibly deep for an animal of its weight, as if it had immense focused power behind each step. And their arrangement, a bipedal gait, with occasional wider impressions that confirmed it dropped to all fours at incredible speed. There were no blood splatters beyond the immediate vicinity of the carcasses, no signs of a prolonged struggle. The animals had simply been opened. The efficiency of the destruction was chilling. He followed the tracks to the edge of the tree line, where they simply vanished, swallowed by the dense undergrowth as if the creature had melted into the forest. A detail, small but gnawing, began to prick at Mark's analytical mind. Many of the animals were not fully consumed. Some were barely touched, their suffering prolonged. It wasn't hunger driving this. This was a demonstration, a chilling, deliberate act of intimidation. The pre-dawn stillness shattered with the sounds of agony, the desperate cries of the dying livestock echoing through the Maine woods. A gruesome serenade, serving as a warning to anyone who dared to listen. It was a calculated act of terror, a clear message delivered in a language of ripped flesh and shattered bone. This wasn't a dumb beast operating on instinct. This was a conscious, malevolent force. The realization sent a shiver down his spine, deeper than the crisp autumn air. The predator he was hired to hunt was far more complex, far more sinister than he had ever anticipated. He chose a spot about 2 miles from the Harper farm, deeper in the sprawling forest, a small, secluded clearing he found using a topographic map and his own keen sense of terrain. Here, amidst the whispering pines and the damp scent of loam, he established his base camp. His pickup, strategically camouflaged, became his command center. He set up a series of hidden cameras, equipped with motion sensors and infrared capabilities, placing them along game trails and potential approach routes. Bait, raw meat, fresh blood, was strategically placed, an invitation for whatever lurked in the shadows. As the first twilight seeped into the woods, painting the world in shades of fading purple and deepening gray, Mark felt it. A prickling sensation on the back of his neck, a subtle shift in the air, a profound sense of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a distant branch, carried intent. The forest, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now held its breath, a vast, living entity that had turned its cold, unblinking gaze upon him. His personal, professional investigation had truly begun. He unholstered his sidearm, a pistol, checking the chamber with a practiced click. This wasn't just a job anymore. This was something that felt profoundly, inexorably wrong. The first few days settled into a tense, unsettling rhythm. Mark patrolled the periphery of his base camp, moving with the preternatural stillness of a man who understood the language of the wilderness. He checked his traps, a variety of snares and pressure plates designed to detect movement rather than capture, and he meticulously reviewed the footage from his hidden cameras. The forest, during the daylight hours, offered nothing but its usual placid facade. The sunlight filtered through the dense canopy in shifting mosaics. Birdsong filled the air, and the wind whispered through the pines with a sound like distant, hushed conversations. But the emptiness felt like a lie. The sensation of being observed never truly dissipated. It clung to him like the damp Maine air, a subtle chill that raised the tiny hairs on his arms. Nights, however, were a different beast entirely. The forest transformed into a theater of the unnerving. Unexplained sounds, faint and fleeting, would drift through the darkness. A rustle that was too heavy for a squirrel, a snap of a twig that spoke of a deliberate tread. And then there were the howls. Long, drawn-out wails that were unlike anything Mark had ever heard. They lacked the mournful cadence of a wolf or the territorial bark of a coyote. These were deeper, more primal, laced with a raw, guttural power that resonated in the very bones of the listener. They spoke of something ancient, something that belonged to the untamed places of the world, something with an intelligence that mocked the simplicity of mere animal instinct. Each sound was a brushstroke in a deepening painting of dread, a constant, low thrum beneath the surface of his awareness. Sleep became a fractured, elusive thing, punctuated by sudden awakenings, his hand already on his weapon, his senses straining against the suffocating darkness. On the fourth night, the fragile peace was violently shattered. A new attack, not on the Harper farm, but on the neighboring O'Malley place, about 2 miles to the west. This time, the destruction was even more extensive. Mark arrived at dawn, the first tendrils of mist still clinging to the ground, to find a scene that made the Harper farm look almost neat. Not only had a dozen head of cattle been ripped apart, but an old, sturdy barn had been partially collapsed. Its thick oak beams, weathered by a century of Maine winters, were splintered and broken, as if a colossal fist had simply punched through the structure. The sheer scale of the brute force required was unprecedented. Farmers, already on edge, gathered in tight, pale-faced knots, their whispers laced with a rising tide of terror. Their fear was a tangible thing, a cold, heavy cloud that hung over the mangled livestock and the ruined outbuilding. Mark, moving through the carnage with his usual methodical efficiency, began to notice a chilling pattern. This wasn't the chaotic rampage of a crazed animal. The predator, whatever it was, operated with a disturbing tactical cunning. It consistently avoided the most heavily guarded areas, those with lights and barking dogs. Instead, it targeted the periphery, the vulnerable flanks of the farms, striking where defenses were weakest. And always, only one attack per night, followed by a total, eerie silence that mocked the terror it had just unleashed. This wasn't a wild beast, driven by the simple, predictable hungers of instinct. This was something that planned that thought, that strategized. The realization sent a fresh wave of unease through Mark, a cold, creeping certainty that he was dealing with an enemy far more sophisticated than anything he had ever faced in his long and dangerous career. This was no mere animal. It was a hunter in its own right, one that understood the art of war. The creeping certainty began to erode his initial assumptions. Every known predator, every beast he'd ever studied or tracked, had a predictable set of behaviors, a logical motive. This thing, whatever it was, defied all logic. No bear, no wolf pack, no mountain lion could achieve this level of destruction, this tactical precision, this chilling sense of deliberate malice. He found himself, almost against his will, mentally sifting through old legends, the kind of campfire tales that were dismissed as rural superstition. The local Native American tribes, he remembered from some long-forgotten reading, spoke of great forest spirits, vengeful entities that guarded the deep woods. And the European settlers, too, had their own dark tales of creatures that walked on 2 legs and 4, of men who transformed under the full moon. He'd always scoffed at such folklore, considering it the fanciful musings of an uneducated populace. But now, in the chilling silence of the Maine woods, with the smell of death heavy in the air, the words werewolf and forest spirit no longer felt like quaint superstitions. They began to echo in his mind, disturbingly, terrifyingly real. Mark escalated his technological arsenal. He deployed additional infrared sensors, tiny, heat-sensitive eyes that detected even the slightest change in temperature. He launched his small, agile drones, equipped with military-grade night vision and thermal imaging, sending them buzzing like mechanical insects over the darkened canopy. He was bringing the full weight of his specialized training, his combat experience, and cutting-edge surveillance against this unseen enemy. Yet the forest swallowed his efforts whole. The cameras, when he reviewed them, showed only blurs, fleeting shadows, sudden glints of light that vanished before they resolved into anything concrete. The creature, or creatures, knew precisely where the electronic eyes were, moving around them, or more chillingly, moving too fast for them to capture. It was a spectral presence, a whisper in the night, a presence that defied capture, leaving only destruction in its wake. Then came the discovery that shattered his existing paradigm completely. While meticulously examining the edge of the O'Malley property, where the destruction was most intense, Mark found it. Tucked beneath the shattered timbers of the barn, half buried in a pile of damp sawdust and scattered straw, was a small scrap of fabric. It was thick, tightly woven, a dark, muted green, not the rough canvas of a farmer's work clothes, nor the sleek synthetic of hunting gear. It was different, almost primitive in its weave, yet undeniably manufactured. The fibers were tough, designed for harsh conditions. This wasn't an animal's fur. This was cloth, a piece of clothing. The discovery was a punch to the gut. It pointed, undeniably, to human presence, to intelligence, to a level of sophistication that went far beyond a mere beast. The detective part of his brain, long dormant, snapped to attention. This changed everything. His opponent wasn't just a creature of instinct. It was something that could wear clothes, something that possessed the cunning of a human mind. The hunt, Mark realized with a growing sense of dread, was turning on him. He felt increasingly as if he wasn't the hunter, but the hunted. The forest, with its ancient trees and endless shadows, had shed its veneer of passive beauty. It was now a living, malevolent entity, breathing around him, watching his every move. Each rustle of leaves, each snapping twig, was no longer just the sound of wildlife. It was a potential threat, a signal from his unseen adversary. The air, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, now carried a subtle, almost electrical tension. He found himself checking his 6, scanning the tree line, his hand hovering over the grip of his rifle more often than not. The quiet hum of his generator, the only constant sound in the night, felt impossibly loud, a beacon in the oppressive darkness. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that a direct confrontation was no longer just a possibility. It was an inevitability. And his trusty, his precision rifle, suddenly felt woefully inadequate against whatever impossible thing lurked in these deep, dark woods. He was alone, and something was waiting. The psychological pressure began to fray the edges of Mark's iron composure. Days bled into sleepless nights. His hard-won experience, his disciplined mind, the very skills that had saved his life countless times in hostile lands, proved impotent here. He was accustomed to calculating risks, to understanding the enemy's capabilities. But this enemy defied all parameters. He tried to maintain his routines, but his focus was fractured, his concentration constantly pulled by the prickling sensation of unseen eyes. Every shadow stretched and shifted, taking on monstrous shapes in his periphery. He caught fleeting reflections in the dark glass of his pickup's windows. A gaunt, hollow-eyed face that barely resembled his own, a stranger trapped in the glass. The rustle of dry leaves, the creak of old branches, even the distant hoot of an owl, all of it charged with an insidious intent. He heard footsteps in places where no steps fell, felt breath on his neck where the air was still. The paranoia was a cold, constant companion, whispering doubts, gnawing at his resolve. He was a man accustomed to control, and control was slipping through his fingers like fine sand. It happened during one of his early morning patrols, deep in a section of woods he hadn't yet thoroughly canvassed, a dense thicket of spruce and balsam fir that smelled of damp earth and decaying needles. The sun was just beginning to burn away the last wisps of fog, painting the undergrowth in hazy, ethereal light. He was moving slowly, meticulously, checking for tracks when a flicker of movement impossibly fast caught his eye. He stopped, freezing instantly, his rifle snapping up to his shoulder in one fluid motion. Through the optical scope, his breath hitched. There, for just a fleeting moment, less than a second, he saw it. It was huge, far larger than any wolf or bear he had ever encountered, covered in thick, dark fur that absorbed the dim light. Its muscles corded beneath the pelt, rippling with raw power. And it was standing on two legs, its form eerily humanoid, though grotesquely distorted. Its head was angled towards him, its eyes, glowing with a dull internal light, bored directly into his. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, melting back into the tangled undergrowth without so much as a disturbed leaf. Mark lowered his rifle, his hands trembling slightly, a tremor that he hated and fought to suppress. He tried to rationalize it. A trick of the light. A bear standing on its hind legs distorted by the morning mist. His mind, the disciplined, logical instrument of a Marine veteran, screamed for an explanation rooted in the known world. But his gut, the primal, instinctual part of him that had kept him alive in impossible situations, roared a different truth. He had seen something impossible, something that defied natural law. The image of those intelligent, glowing eyes burned behind his own. He forced himself to take slow, deep breaths, pushing back the rising tide of panic. This wasn't a time for fear. It was a time for cold, hard assessment. What he had witnessed demanded a complete overhaul of every tactic, every assumption, every single parameter of his hunt. He was no longer pursuing an animal. He was pursuing a nightmare, a creature of myth made flesh. Desperate for any shred of concrete information, Mark decided to seek out the nearest semblance of civilization. He drove his truck towards a collection of dilapidated buildings about 10 miles from his camp, a place marked on his map as a township, but which looked more like a permanent roadside attraction for the forgotten. The few locals he found, mostly elderly men with deeply lined faces and wary eyes, huddled around a perpetually smoldering barrel fire outside a general store that smelled of stale coffee and desperation, were suspicious, tight-lipped, and radiating an almost palpable fear. They spoke in hushed tones of the forest beast, of a punishment for intruding, of things best left alone. They mumbled about old tales, passed down through generations, of a shadow that walked the woods, but none would offer specifics. Their fear was a thick, oppressive blanket, stifling any attempt at rational conversation. They simply shook their heads, their gazes sliding away from his, dismissing him with an almost ritualistic, superstitious wave of a hand. The message was clear. They knew something, but they weren't talking. And they wanted him gone. Frustrated, Mark attempted to contact the local authorities. He found the county sheriff's office in a slightly larger, though equally moribund town 20 miles further down the main road. The sheriff, a paunchy man named Higgins with a tired face and a perpetually slumped posture, listened to Mark's careful, professional summary of the livestock attacks and the bizarre tracks with an air of practiced indifference. He dismissed Mark's concerns, waving a dismissive hand. "Just a big bear, son, or a pack of feral dogs. Farmers get mighty jumpy this time of year." He offered platitudes about reassuring the locals and keeping the peace. But beneath the surface of his feigned calm, Mark sensed a deeper current. Higgins clearly wanted no part of whatever was happening in the deep woods. He subtly suggested that Mark pack up his gear and leave, that he was only stirring up trouble and attracting unwanted attention to the region. It solidified Mark's growing suspicion. The local power structure was complicit in a cover-up and profoundly terrified. They were certainly not going to help him. The realization settled over Mark with the weight of a granite slab. He was utterly, completely alone in this. No backup, no official support, no one to trust. Just him, his gear, and the impossible creatures that haunted these woods. It was a familiar feeling, one that brought back the stark, brutal clarity of his military days, operating deep behind enemy lines, isolated and cut off, relying solely on his wits and his training. But those enemies had been human, predictable in their cruelties and their motivations. This was different. This was beyond the reach of his tactical manuals, beyond the scope of anything he had ever been taught. His Marine training allowed him to maintain a cool exterior, to compartmentalize the fear and the gnawing questions. But the sheer weight of responsibility, the chilling enormity of what he was facing pressed down on him, a crushing burden in the vast, indifferent wilderness. He stood by the flickering flame of his small campfire, watching the sparks spiral into the inky blackness above the pines. His rifle, a silent companion, lay across his lap. The hunt, he finally understood, had fundamentally shifted. He was no longer pursuing an animal driven by instinct, a beast that could be understood through biology and tracking skills. He had stumbled into something that defied all known categories, something that existed on the blurred boundary between reality and nightmare. His mission was no longer about extermination. It was about comprehension. He needed to understand the intelligence that orchestrated these attacks, the mind that lay behind the monstrous form. This was no longer a simple contract job. This was a desperate, terrifying quest for answers, a perilous journey into the heart of the unknown. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow, that the most dangerous game he would ever play had only just begun. Mark returned to his truck camp. The unsettling image of the bipedal creature burned into his mind, the sheriff's dismissive words still echoing with a hollow ring. He spread his maps across the battered picnic table he used as a workstation, a lantern casting a weak, flickering light over the topographical lines and handwritten notations. He stopped looking for random points of attack and began searching for a pattern. He meticulously marked each incident, each farm, each patch of ravaged land. Slowly, painstakingly, a disturbing truth began to emerge. The attacks were not random acts of a foraging beast. They were concentrated almost exclusively along the periphery of a vast, uninhabited stretch of forest, a territory roughly 12 miles across. And crucially, the victims, the livestock, were consistently mutilated in a way that maximized terror without entirely wiping out the farmer's livelihood. It wasn't about consumption, it was about control, about sending a message that was brutal but specific. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The attacks formed a perimeter, an invisible, savage cordon around an enormous segment of the deep woods. This wasn't a random hunting ground. It was a defined, defended territory. An invisible force, a line drawn in blood and fear that people were not meant to cross. The sporadic nature of the attacks, the calculated brutality, the targeting of specific points, it all pointed to a deliberate strategy. This wasn't an accident of nature. It was a statement of ownership, a warning scrawled in torn flesh and splintered wood. Mark felt a cold dread trickle down his spine. He wasn't just dealing with a monster. He was dealing with entities that understood boundaries, that possessed a territorial imperative far more sophisticated than anything he had encountered. Driven by this new understanding, Mark pushed deeper into the untouched heart of the cordoned-off forest, moving with an even greater stealth and caution. He was no longer simply tracking. He was searching for communication, for signs of an intelligent presence. In the oldest, most remote sections, on the gnarled, moss-covered trunks of ancient pines and oaks, he found them. Carved deep into the bark were crude, primitive symbols. They were unlike any human graffiti or trapper's mark he'd ever seen. Some resembled totemistic figures, angular and stark. Others were more abstract, glyph-like, reminiscent of an ancient language. They looked incredibly old, weathered by countless seasons, their edges softened by time. But here and there, amidst the ancient carvings, were fresh ones, their lines sharp and clean, indicating recent activity. This wasn't merely a beast defending its territory. This was a culture, a system of communication, a silent declaration of ownership etched into the very skin of the forest. The implication was staggering. Then came the chilling, undeniable certainty that he, Mark Downey, was not just an impartial observer caught in the crossfire. He was part of their game. The strange, non-lethal attacks on the farms were not just meant to terrorize the locals. They were also a test for him. His traps, meticulously placed, were consistently circumvented, never sprung. His cameras, discreetly positioned, were deftly avoided, and more unnervingly, subtly disabled, their batteries mysteriously drained and their lenses covered, but never physically damaged. It was not a struggle for food or survival. It was a contest of wills, a complex, high-stakes game for control of territory. And he, the self-proclaimed hunter, was clearly designated as a central player. The realization was both infuriating and terrifying. He was being probed, analyzed, studied by an intelligence that anticipated his every move. In a remote hollow, deep within the heart of the restricted zone, Mark stumbled upon an old, dilapidated hunting cabin, its roof caved in, its windows long shattered. It had been abandoned for decades, left to the mercies of the elements. Yet, as he cautiously pushed open the creaking door, he found signs of recent occupation. Not trash or scattered debris, but a surprising, almost unnerving order. A small, roughly hewn table held a collection of carefully arranged, if crude, cooking utensils. A pile of blankets lay neatly folded in one corner. On a makeshift shelf, amidst a few hand-carved tools, primitively effective but undeniably designed for specific tasks, lay something truly astonishing. It was a well-worn copy of a field guide to local flora and fauna, its pages dog-eared and marked with numerous underlined passages. The edges of the book were worn smooth, as if it had been handled countless times, studied with an intense, deliberate focus. It was irrefutable proof. These predators possessed not only cunning but intelligence. They could read. They could learn. They were, in a terrifying and fundamental way, sentient. This revelation demanded a complete paradigm shift. He was no longer hunting. He was being hunted. He altered his strategy dramatically. He stopped actively seeking them out. Instead, he made himself the bait. He meticulously constructed a complex, multi-layered ambush around his camp, drawing on every scrap of his military training in counterinsurgency and special operations. He used a combination of tripwires, almost invisible pressure plates, and strategically placed sound emitters, creating a perimeter that would detect any approach. He then intentionally introduced weak points, visible gaps in his defenses, a tempting invitation for an intelligent adversary to exploit. He would make himself vulnerable and exposed nerve and wait for them to come to him. He was turning the hunt into a chess match, with himself as the most valuable piece. The nights that followed were an exercise in exquisite torment. The knowledge that he was deliberately exposing himself, that he was inviting contact, amplified the already unbearable tension. He felt the forest come alive around him, not just with the sounds of nature, but with the presence of unseen eyes. Distant animal cries, no longer merely background noise, now sounded like coded signals, a part of a larger, terrifying game. The wind, whistling through the gaps in the cabin walls, carried whispers of judgment. Every breaking branch, every rustle in the undergrowth was a calculated move in this silent, deadly dance. He lay awake, his senses stretched to their breaking point, his rifle clutched tight, listening to the subtle shifts in the night air, waiting for the inevitable. The collision he knew was coming, but it would be on their terms, not his. And he had a chilling premonition that it would be nothing like he had ever prepared for. Mark spent the better part of a week meticulously refining his ambush, each wire, each sensor, each blind spot considered with the precision of a seasoned combat engineer. He chose his location carefully. A small, almost perfectly circular clearing about a mile from his cabin, tucked deep within a stand of old-growth pines where the canopy was so dense that moonlight rarely touched the forest floor. He became the silent, waiting center of this elaborate web. Using his hard-won skills in camouflage and fieldcraft, he blended into the dense undergrowth at the edge of the clearing, becoming an indistinguishable part of the forest itself. His heart hammered a slow, heavy beat against his ribs, a primal drum that echoed the wildness around him, yet his mind remained a cold, calculating machine, detached and focused. Every nerve ending was alight, every sense strained to its absolute limit. The waiting stretched on, an eternity measured in the slow drift of pine pollen and the muted chirps of unseen insects. Then, as midnight approached, the sounds began. Faint at first, almost imperceptible, just beyond the range of his sensors. A soft rustling, a subtle displacement of air that spoke of heavy bodies moving through dense vegetation. Then, a low, guttural growl, not aggressive but deep and resonant, vibrated through the very earth beneath him. It was a sound that didn't come from any single direction. It enveloped him, an acoustic curtain drawn tight around the clearing. What chilled him most was the realization that these sounds, these movements, were bypassing his carefully laid traps. They were moving with an unnatural awareness. They knew every single one of his intricate preparations. Then, from the impenetrable darkness at the edge of the clearing, they emerged. Not a single creature, but several. Silhouettes, darker than the night itself, began to separate from the shadows. They moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, a silent, almost ethereal procession that belied their immense power. Mark brought his night vision binoculars to his eyes, the world flaring into shades of phosphorescent green. He swallowed hard, the metallic taste of fear coating his tongue. They were everything the legends hinted at, and infinitely worse. Large, impossibly muscled forms, covered in thick, matted fur the color of deep shadow. Their heads were lupine, but with a horrifying, intelligent cast. And their eyes, those eyes, they glowed with an eerie, predatory light, not reflecting light, but emanating it from within. Burning pinpricks of malevolence and terrifying awareness in the green-tinted darkness. These were not wolves. These were not men. These were werewolves, caught in the throes of their impossible, horrifying transformation. The pack made no aggressive moves. They didn't charge, didn't snarl. Instead, they began to encircle Mark, moving with a deliberate, almost ritualistic slowness. The ring of glowing eyes tightened around him, a silent, implacable siege. There was no overt aggression in their movements, but an undeniable sense of superior power, of an ancient, terrifying authority. Mark felt a crawl of gooseflesh race up his arms and prickle at the back of his neck. His rifle, a custom-built tool of deadly precision, felt like a child's toy against the silent, overwhelming force surrounding him. He was one man, armed with the finest human technology, but he was utterly alone against a dozen of these impossible creatures. The odds were not merely stacked against him, they were obliterated. The psychological pressure was excruciating. The werewolves made no sound, offered no threatening gestures beyond their sheer presence. They simply stood, a living, breathing ring of primal terror, and watched him. Their gazes were impossibly penetrating, intelligent, dissecting. Mark felt stripped bare, his every thought, every instinct laid open for their inspection. He was not a threat to be eliminated. He was an object of study. His breath hitched in his throat, each inhale a ragged, desperate gasp. The controlled, measured beat of his heart began to quicken, threatening to burst from his chest. This was a form of psychological warfare far beyond anything he had ever experienced. A silent, terrifying assault on his very sanity. Then, one of them moved. The largest of the pack, a towering figure that dwarfed the others, took a deliberate step forward, breaking the perfect circle. It did not growl. It did not snarl. Instead, it emitted a sound that was less an animalistic roar and more a deep, resonant, warning cough, a sound that rumbled from the depths of its massive chest. Mark instinctively tightened his grip on his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. But he didn't shoot. Something deep inside him, a cold, calculated instinct born of years of survival, screamed at him to hold his fire. He wasn't in a hunting scenario. He was in a test. He was being measured, assessed. His courage and his intelligence weighed in the balance. The full, crushing weight of his situation descended upon him. All his elaborate traps, all his years of training, all his tactical brilliance, it had all been for naught. He hadn't hunted them. They had allowed him to think he was hunting. He hadn't caught them. He was the one caught, held in their terrible, intelligent gaze. A profound sense of helplessness, a primal, gut-wrenching terror, washed over him, threatening to unravel his hard-earned composure. But the Marine in him, the professional, refused to surrender. He forced himself to breathe, to focus, to prepare for whatever horrific climax awaited him. He stood his ground, rifle pointed, a lone human caught in the green glow of night vision, awaiting an outcome that defied all rational understanding. The seconds stretched into an unbearable eternity. Mark stood, weapon poised, his finger a hair's breadth from the trigger, every muscle screaming for release, for action. Yet a deeper instinct, primal and overriding, held him motionless. "Don't shoot," it whispered, a cold, rational voice cutting through the thrumming fear. He focused on the largest of the creatures, the one that had stepped forward, its glowing eyes fixed on him with an unnerving, intelligent intensity. Around him, the other dozen werewolves remained perfectly still, their forms indistinguishable from the surrounding shadows save for the faint internal light of their eyes. Each creature was a coiled spring of immense power, their collective gaze a physical weight pressing down on him, dissecting his every reaction. Then, the impossible began. The massive werewolf, its fur shimmering darkly in the faint light, began to change. It was a horrifying, bone-jarring spectacle, yet possessed of a terrifying liquid grace. The thick fur receded, melting back into its skin. Its massive frame shuddered. Its bones crackled with sickening pops and groans, audible even from Mark's position. The lupine muzzle shortened, the snout retracting, the teeth diminishing. The muscular limbs, though still powerful, subtly altered, becoming less animalistic, more human in their articulation. The transformation was agonizingly slow, yet shockingly swift, a forced evolution playing out before his disbelieving eyes. It was a visceral, horrifying ballet of flesh and bone, but it was almost entirely silent, a testament to the creature's control. Standing before Mark, where the towering werewolf had been, was a man. He was powerfully built, tall and lean, with the kind of sinewy strength that suggested a life of relentless physical exertion. His face, weathered and deeply lined, was a testament to years of struggle, a map of countless battles etched onto his skin. He appeared to be in his late 40s, his hair a tangled iron-gray mass that framed a pair of eyes that were both ancient and piercingly intelligent. There was no trace of the feral aggression Mark had seen in the creature's gaze. Instead, these eyes held a profound weariness, an ancient wisdom, and an unnervingly calm authority. His clothes, though rough and patched, were practical. Sturdy leather pants, a thick wool tunic, and boots that looked like they had been hand-stitched for deep woods living. He was a man of the forest, forged by it, a living embodiment of the untamed wilderness. The man took another slow step forward, his gaze never leaving Mark's. His voice, when it came, was a low, guttural rumble, laced with a surprising warmth despite its rough edges. "You're not on a hunt, Mark Downey," he said, his words echoing in the sudden profound silence of the clearing. "You are on a trial. We knew you would come." The words were not a question. They were a statement of fact, delivered with an undeniable, quiet certainty. They pierced Mark, cutting through his fear and confusion, striking at the very core of his understanding. The meticulously constructed reality of his world began to crack, shedding its fragile skin. He was not the predator here. He was the subject. The hunter was now the observed. The man who introduced himself as Caleb, the pack's leader, began to speak, his voice a steady, measured cadence that filled the pre-dawn stillness. The truth he unfolded was a stark, cold splash of water on Mark's face. It wasn't the desperate farmers who had called the anonymous intermediary. It was Caleb and his pack. They had manipulated the channels, used their influence to lure a specific kind of man into their territory. Not just any hunter, but one with a reputation for pragmatism, for cold efficiency, a former Marine who understood the brutal realities of survival, a man with a deeply ingrained code of honor, however tarnished by the grim work he performed. And most importantly, a man with an open mind, capable of seeing beyond the rigid confines of human belief. Caleb explained their true purpose. They didn't need a killer. They needed a conduit, a bridge between their world and the encroaching, volatile world of humans. They were an ancient, hidden people, living in these deep woods for centuries, maintaining a fragile balance. Their attacks on the livestock, the calculated destruction, the terrifying displays of power, they were not acts of senseless violence or bloodlust. They were carefully orchestrated warnings, boundary markers, designed to keep humans from encroaching further into their ancestral lands. They had no desire to destroy human communities, only to preserve their own, to maintain the delicate ecosystem that sustained them both. Mark's role, as Caleb envisioned it, was to become their forest ranger, their liaison, a mediator who interpreted their unspoken language of warning to the human world. Caleb extended his hand, not in greeting, but in an offer, an ultimatum veiled in the quiet authority of his gaze. "You have seen us. You understand our purpose. Now you have a choice. You can join us. Become our voice in the world of men. Help us maintain the balance. Or you can become another threat, another force that seeks to destroy what we have built. And if you choose that path," Caleb's voice dropped, becoming a low, resonant growl that hinted at the monstrous power lurking beneath the human facade, "then we will be forced to act differently." The consequences of refusal were not spoken aloud, but they were etched in the depths of Caleb's ancient eyes, clear as the stark Maine morning. Mark stood frozen, the heavy weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. His life, he realized, had just changed irrevocably. The world, once brutal and uncomplicated, had just revealed a terrifying, impossible layer beneath its surface. For a long, silent moment, Mark stood his ground, the weight of Caleb's ultimatum pressing down on him. His mind, trained for combat, now wrestled with a paradox that defied every logical parameter he knew. Resistance was not just futile, It was a death sentence. The pragmatic core of his being, the part that prioritized survival and effective action, asserted itself. This was an opportunity, however terrifying, to understand a truth far deeper than any he'd ever encountered. With a slow, deliberate movement, Mark lowered his rifle, the soft click of the safety catching the crisp morning air. He met Caleb's gaze, a single, firm nod serving as his answer. He was in. The world had cracked open and he had chosen to step through the fissure. The days that followed were a surreal blur of intense learning and adaptation. Mark spent hours, then days, deep within the pack's territory, under Caleb's watchful, guiding eye. What he saw was not the chaos of monsters, but the intricate order of a complex, highly organized society. The pack was a cohesive unit, bound by unspoken rules, a deep reverence for their forest home, and a strict yet fluid hierarchy. Their existence was primitive, rooted in the hunt and the rhythm of the seasons, but it was far from savage. They moved with a silent, disciplined efficiency, hunting the plentiful deer and moose that roamed the vast Maine woods, always mindful of overhunting, always respecting the delicate balance of the ecosystem. They held their territories sacred, moving with an ancient understanding of invisible boundaries that they defended with lethal force, but preferred to delineate with warnings. Caleb, often in his human form, spent long hours explaining the true nature of his kind to Mark. They were not victims of some ancient curse, nor were they supernatural entities in the human understanding of the word. They were, Caleb insisted, a unique biological species, a rare apex predator capable of a profound physical transformation. Their power was not magic. It was a genetic trait, a deeply ingrained biological response to environmental and lunar cycles. Their enhanced senses, their incredible strength, their startling speed. These were merely extensions of their natural capabilities. And their intelligence, the very thing that had so unnerved Mark, was not a human anomaly within an animalistic form. It was a vital tool, a product of millennia of evolution, honed to ensure their survival in a world increasingly dominated by a more numerous, often destructive human presence. Mark's role, as defined by Caleb, was clear and daunting. He was to be their buffer, their interpreter, their forest ranger in the truest sense. His task was to understand the invisible red lines that defined the pack's territory and their acceptable levels of human encroachment. More importantly, he had to communicate these boundaries to the human world, to deflect their suspicions, to redirect their investigations, to prevent a full-scale, catastrophic conflict. His first mission involved investigating the very farm attacks he had initially been hired to stop. He was to provide plausible, logical explanations for the destruction. Rogue grizzlies, packs of unusually large, feral dogs, and some deranged, reclusive local. Anything to calm the escalating fear, to redirect the focus, to buy the pack time and safety. He returned to his cabin, his sanctuary now feeling like a stage for a perilous act. Mark began to live a precarious double life. By day, he was the taciturn, capable hunter, offering his services to the nervous farmers, helping them reinforce fences, repairing damaged barns, all the while subtly steering their suspicions away from the impossible truth. He would dismiss the wilder rumors, shake his head at the talk of monsters, and attribute the damage to mundane, oversized beasts. But by night, his world shifted. He would meet Caleb in predetermined clearings, deep in the moon-drenched woods, listening to the subtle reports of the pack's patrols, studying the flow of their movements, learning the ancient paths and hidden places of their territory. He became a silent witness to their nocturnal lives, seeing them not as terrifying beasts, but as a living, breathing part of the forest, a wild, powerful family in their truest form. Yet despite Mark's careful maneuvering and calculated reassurances, the fear among the local human population stubbornly refused to abate. The memory of the mangled livestock and the splintered barns lingered like a rank odor. Some of the farmers, particularly those who had lost the most, grew increasingly frustrated with the perceived inaction of the authorities. They began to take matters into their own hands. Shotguns and rifles, long gathering dust in closets, were pulled out and cleaned. Makeshift watchtowers were erected, their flickering lanterns casting long, nervous shadows across the fields. They started organizing, small groups of armed men patrolling their land, their anger and their fear coalescing into a dangerous, volatile force. Whispers of vigilante justice and hunting the beast ourselves grew louder, more insistent, fueled by desperation and a thirst for retribution. Mark felt the delicate situation spiraling out of his control. His carefully constructed role as mediator became increasingly tenuous. A thin thread stretched taut between two increasingly hostile worlds. He saw the tension in Caleb's eyes during their nightly meetings, the subtle hardening of the old leader's jaw as he listened to Mark's reports of rising human aggression. Caleb knew, and Mark knew, that the pack could only endure so much encroachment, so much provocation, before they would be forced to respond. Mark found himself caught on a razor's edge, an alien in both camps. The humans, still his own kind, were beginning to see him as an unwelcome outsider, a strange, quiet man who offered little comfort. And while the pack had accepted him, he was still undeniably human, an anomaly in their ancient, wild world. He was a bridge, but the chasm between the two sides was widening, threatening to tear him apart. In the quiet pre-dawn hours, deep within the ancient woods, Mark found himself in the unprecedented position of giving tactical advice to a pack of shape-shifting predators. Caleb, still in human form, listened intently, his wise ancient eyes absorbing every word. Mark, tapping into his vast military experience, laid out the realities of human warfare. He explained the effective range and destructive power of modern firearms, the psychological impact of concentrated fire, the mob mentality that swept through a fearful armed crowd. He detailed ambush strategies, counter-ambush tactics, the importance of maintaining cohesion under pressure. Each word felt like a betrayal, a knife twisting in the complex knot of his loyalties. Yet he believed he was preventing a far greater tragedy, saving lives on both sides of a widening, impossible chasm. The farmers' meetings escalated in frequency and intensity. Mark, sometimes under the cover of darkness, sometimes feigning a casual walk-through, attended several of these gatherings. He kept his distance, a silent observer in the back, assessing the mood, watching the faces. A man named Matt had emerged as their de facto leader. Matt, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with a grizzled beard and eyes that burned with a fanatical zeal, had lost nearly his entire herd. His charisma was undeniable, his rage infectious. He spoke of reclaiming what was ours, of driving the beast back to hell, of taking what the lazy sheriff wouldn't. The The words were laced with hatred, fueled by fear and loss, and they resonated deeply with the desperate, frightened men and women around him. The calls for violence grew louder, coalescing into a terrifying, unified roar. The dilemma gnawed at Mark, a relentless, aching pain in his gut. He was a man of the human world, bound by its laws, its understanding, its fears. Yet, he had seen the other side, witnessed the ancient, disciplined existence of the pack, understood their desperate struggle for survival against an encroaching tide. He had come to believe in their right to exist, to defend their territory. He stood at a precipice, forced to choose between the species to which he belonged by birth and the strange, impossible species that had, in its own way, accepted him. This choice, he knew, would define not just his mission, but the very essence of who he was. There was no easy answer, only shades of gray and the terrifying certainty of irreversible consequences. Caleb, sensing the approaching storm, gave Mark a final, desperate mission, a last warning to the farmers. Mark attempted to convey the urgency of the situation to Sheriff Higgins, stressing the organized nature of the farmers' burgeoning militia, the potential for catastrophic bloodshed. But the sheriff merely waved him off, his eyes glazed with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. "Mark, son, you're getting yourself all worked up. It's just a bunch of angry farmers blowing off steam. They'll calm down." Direct contact with Matt proved even more futile. Mark found the man surrounded by his armed followers, his eyes burning with an almost religious fervor. Matt saw Mark not as a messenger, but as an obstacle, a strange, taciturn man who had failed to protect them. He dismissed Mark's warnings as cowardice, as an attempt to dissuade them from their righteous path. "We're done waiting, Downey," Matt snarled, his voice thick with a vengeful certainty. "This ends tonight." The tension in the woods grew unbearable. The nights became a restless symphony of distant animal cries and the subtle, almost imperceptible movements of the pack. The werewolves began their own warning patrols, making their presence known, though briefly, on the edges of the human settlements. Flickering shadows, guttural growls that carried on the night air, the brief, terrifying glimpse of a hulking bipedal form at the edge of the tree line. They sought to intimidate, to frighten, to push the humans back without physical confrontation. But instead of retreating, the farmers saw this as a direct challenge, a confirmation of their worst fears. Their resolve hardened, fueled by a potent cocktail of terror and righteousness. Mark's intelligence, gleaned from careful observation and the uneasy whispers he overheard, confirmed his worst fears. The farmers were indeed planning a full-scale hunt. It wasn't a casual outing. It was a punitive expedition, a systematic sweep deep into the forest. They intended to move in a coordinated line, using their numbers, their firearms, their crude traps, and even torches to smoke out the beast. This was no longer just about protecting their livestock. It was about eradication, about a perceived invasion of their way of life. It was, in every sense of the word, a declaration of war. Mark returned to Caleb's secluded den, the chilling news heavy on his tongue. The old leader listened in silence, his human face set in grim lines, his eyes hardening with a dangerous resolve. He knew, as Mark knew, that the time for peaceful solutions was over. The tipping point had been reached. Mark felt a strange, cold anticipation bubbling in his gut, a mix of dread and the terrible, familiar adrenaline of a man facing an unavoidable conflict. He knew he would be in the very eye of this storm, caught between two warring worlds. His role, once that of a mediator, would now be something far more perilous, far more decisive. The fight was coming, and he would be a critical part of it, whether he wanted to or not. The moon, a sliver of white behind a dense blanket of Maine clouds, offered little light. A thick, oppressive darkness had swallowed the forest whole. Under this inky cloak, dozens of armed farmers, their faces grim masks of fear and grim determination, pushed into the ancient woods. Matt, his grizzled beard catching the faint glow of the lanterns they carried, led the charge, his voice a low, fervent growl. They were a terrifying procession, armed with hunting rifles, heavy-gauge shotguns, long-bladed knives, and flickering torches that cast dancing, monstrous shadows on the trees. The air hummed with their nervous energy, the metallic tang of fear, and the undeniable scent of impending conflict. Mark, having received Caleb's concise, almost telepathic instructions, knew the pack's defensive positions. The werewolves, now fully transformed and moving with silent, predatory grace, had taken up strategic positions on the higher ground overlooking the main game trails, utilizing the dense thicket and ancient rock formations as perfect cover. They waited, unseen, unheard, allowing the human hunting party to push deeper and deeper into their ancestral territory, luring them into the heart of their wild domain. The forest itself held its breath, a vast, silent witness to the encroaching storm. A cold, clear resolve solidified in Mark's mind. He had tried to prevent this. He had tried to bridge the gap. But now, as the two worlds hurtled towards inevitable collision, he knew he couldn't stand by and allow a slaughter. Not of the humans, his own kind, driven by fear, however misguided, and not of the pack, who had offered him a glimpse into their impossible world. He broke from his hidden observation point, plunging headlong into the dense undergrowth, driven by an almost desperate urge to avert the impending bloodshed. He ran through the tangled mess of branches and dead leaves, his boots thudding softly on the forest floor, his breath ragged in the cold night air. His objective was clear: to get between them. He burst through a curtain of low-hanging spruce branches, almost colliding with the vanguard of the farmer's expedition. Matt, his face a grim caricature in the flickering torchlight, spun around, his shotgun raising instinctively. "Downey? What in hell are you doing here?" he bellowed, his voice a mixture of surprise and fury. Mark stumbled, his chest heaving, and tried to speak, tried to warn them, to convince them to turn back before it was too late. But his words, desperate and urgent, were drowned out by the rising clamor of the approaching mob, the metallic clatter of their weapons, and the desperate resolve that had consumed them. The tide of humanity was too strong, too driven by fear and vengeance, to be turned by a single voice. Then, from the impenetrable darkness to the left flank, a shadow detached itself from the trees. It was fleeting, a massive, hulking shape that moved with unnatural speed. A rifle cracked, a nervous, accidental shot from one of the younger farmers, his finger slipping on the trigger. It was all the signal that was needed. The forest, which had been holding its breath, exploded. Gunfire ripped through the stillness, a deafening cacophony of sound. Bullets tore through the leaves above Mark's head, kicking up dirt and splinters as he instinctively dove for cover behind a thick-barked oak. He heard it then, cutting through the din of human weaponry. The deep, guttural growl of the werewolves, a sound of ancient fury and territorial defense, finally revealing themselves. The pack attacked with terrifying, disciplined precision. They didn't charge headlong into the line of fire. Instead, they appeared from nowhere, massive, shadowy forms materializing out of the darkness, striking at the flanks, at the vulnerable edges of the human formation. They moved with blinding speed, their powerful bodies smashing into the farmers, not to kill, but to disorient, to break their will, to sow panic. Claws ripped at clothing, at rifles, at anything they disarmed or disabled. They were a whirlwind of fur and muscle, using their strength to shatter weapons, to knock men off their feet, to scatter their formations. Their objective was not a bloody massacre, but a rout. A deliberate, terrifying display of overwhelming force designed to instill a fear so profound it would shatter the human will to fight. The scene erupted into utter, uncontrollable chaos. The screams of the farmers, a chilling symphony of terror and pain, mingled with the guttural growls of the werewolves and the relentless crackle of gunfire. The air filled with the acrid scent of gunpowder, the metallic tang of fear, and the pungent odor of crushed pine needles and disturbed earth. Branches snapped, wood splintered, and men cried out as they were struck or knocked to the ground. The farmers, accustomed to hunting deer or bear, were utterly unprepared for an enemy that moved like a shadow, struck with the force of a battering ram, and refused to go down. Their organized line dissolved into a panicked, every man for himself scramble. This was no longer a hunt. It was a desperate, terrifying rout, where the hunters had suddenly found themselves to be the helpless, unprepared prey. Mark found himself in the terrifying eye of the storm, a lone human caught between the furious, desperate charge of his own kind and the ancient, primal fury of the pack. He saw the stark terror in the farmers' eyes, their desperation as their organized front dissolved into chaos. He felt the cold, unyielding resolve in the werewolves, their unblinking determination to protect their home, their very existence. There was no time for deliberation. He had to act, and he had to act fast. A massive, shadowy form, one of the younger, more aggressive werewolves, lunged towards a wounded farmer who lay screaming on the damp earth, clutching a shattered leg. Mark, propelled by an instinct that transcended loyalty or logic, reacted. He raised his rifle and fired a single shot into the air, the sharp report momentarily cutting through the din. The werewolf, startled, paused, its glowing eyes turning towards him. Mark then threw himself between the beast and the cowering farmer, his body a shield, his rifle a barrier. He met the werewolf's gaze, a silent, unyielding challenge. He would not allow them to kill, not like this, not even those who were effectively his enemies in this desperate conflict. Caleb, appearing suddenly in his human form, materialized beside Mark. His eyes, usually filled with ancient wisdom, now held a deep, unreadable question, a mix of curiosity and an unspoken challenge. Mark met his gaze, a quick, almost imperceptible nod passing between them. The nod was an acknowledgement of their agreement, a reaffirmation of his chosen path, but it also conveyed a silent message. A different tactic was needed now. This couldn't devolve into a senseless slaughter. There was a fragile balance to maintain, and this, Mark realized, was the moment to enforce it. Then, with a terrifying, deliberate grace, Caleb began to transform. The farmers closest to them, already reeling from the chaos, watched in stunned, horrified silence as their leader's body twisted and swelled, his clothes tearing, his skin sprouting coarse fur, his face elongating into a snarling muzzle. It was a grotesque, agonizing spectacle, yet possessed of an undeniable brutal power. The sight of the transformation, raw and impossible, froze the retreating farmers in their tracks. Mark watched as the last vestiges of human reason drained from their faces, replaced by a pure primal terror. Their hands trembled, their weapons clattered to the ground, their eyes wide with uncomprehending horror. Seizing the profound moment of shock and confusion, Mark found his voice. He filled his lungs, drawing on every ounce of his military command, his voice cutting through the fading sounds of battle, amplified by the sheer authority he had earned in this impossible conflict. "Here!" he bellowed, his voice a rasp against the night. "Your bullets are useless. Your numbers mean nothing. If you want to live, you get out of this forest. You go back to your farms, and you never, ever return." His words, laced with the unshakable certainty of a man who now understood the impossible, echoed through the suddenly quiet woods, gaining a terrifying weight from the hulking, transformed figure of Caleb standing silently beside him. Mark's ultimatum, delivered with such fierce conviction and underscored by the impossible reality of Caleb's transformation, finally broke them. The farmers, already battered and utterly broken by fear, began a chaotic, desperate retreat. They dropped their weapons, abandoning their futile hunt, stumbling over roots and rocks, fleeing back the way they had come. Matt, his face a rictus of shock and defeated rage, tried to rally them, tried to resist, but his words were lost in the tide of panicked flight. His own comrades, gripped by a terror that stripped them of all reason, dragged him away, pulling him deeper into the darkness and away from the impossible horror they had witnessed. The forest gradually fell silent. The only sounds the receding rustle of panicked footsteps and the ragged breathing of the wounded. The werewolves ceased their pursuit, observing the headlong flight of the humans with an ancient predatory satisfaction. Mark remained standing in the center of the clearing, surrounded by the shadows of the pack, their glowing eyes now watching him with a different kind of intensity. The victory was undeniable, decisive, but its taste was bitter, heavy with the knowledge of what had been lost. He was a man without a country, an alien to his own kind, yet still an outsider in the wild, ancient world he had just chosen to protect. He was a bridge, but the cost of building it had been the complete and utter demolition of his old life. The forest, after the farmers' panicked retreat, settled into a profound, almost unnatural silence. It was a silence that held the lingering scent of gunpowder, fear, and blood. Mark stood on the dew-kissed clearing, his body aching, his muscles strung tight, the last tendrils of adrenaline slowly receding. He felt utterly drained, hollowed out, but undeniably alive. The shadowy forms of the retreating werewolves, their glowing eyes fixed on him, began to melt back into the deeper woods. Caleb, having already resumed his human form, approached Mark. He said nothing, his face a stoic mask, but his eyes, ancient and wise, held a depth of respect and a quiet, profound gratitude that needed no words. He simply inclined his head, a gesture of profound acknowledgement. Then, one by one, the other members of the pack, as they passed by, repeated the gesture. Some, as if compelled by an unspoken understanding, even touched his shoulder, their calloused, powerful hands offering a silent testament of acceptance. Mark understood. They had witnessed his choice, his courage, his willingness to stand between their world and his own. He was, in their own wild, untamed way, one of them now. He was a part of their impossible world. The walk back to his cabin was a long, arduous journey. His body screamed with fatigue, his mind a chaotic kaleidoscope of images. The raw fear in the farmer's eyes, the terrifying grace of the transforming Caleb, the guttural snarls, the desperate pleas. He replayed his choice, his intervention, over and over, weighing the immense cost against the fragile peace he had managed to secure. His new role, his new identity, settled over him with the weight of a granite slab. The solitude of the forest, once a comfort, now felt like a profound, inescapable prison. Upon reaching his cabin, the familiar scent of old leather and gun oil a strange, distant comfort, Mark began to inspect his body for injuries. He found several deep, ragged scratches on his neck and left shoulder, souvenirs from the chaotic skirmish, inflicted when he had instinctively pushed a charging werewolf away from a vulnerable farmer. The wounds burned, a hot, throbbing pain that settled deep in his bones. He disinfected them meticulously, the alcohol a sharp sting against the raw flesh, then bandaged them, his movements slow and deliberate, each touch a reminder of the night's impossible reality. As the days bled into weeks, a grim realization settled over Mark. There was no going back. The farmers, those who had seen him stand with the monsters, considered him a traitor, a monster accomplice. His carefully cultivated reputation as a pragmatic problem solver, a man who dealt in the shadows, was utterly shattered, replaced by suspicion and fear. He was an outcast now, a pariah to his own kind, a man stranded on the desolate shore between two worlds. He became a true hermit, avoiding any contact with the nearest settlements, his truck rarely leaving the secluded path to his cabin. The solitude, once a choice, was now an inescapable fact of his existence. That isolation was soon punctuated by a new, disturbing phenomenon: nightmares. They were vivid, visceral, and terrifyingly real. He dreamed of running through the dense Maine woods on all fours, the wind whipping through thick fur, the scent of pine and damp earth overwhelmingly sharp, the ground a blur beneath his pounding paws. He felt the primal thrill of the hunt, the raw, untamed power coursing through his muscles. Then, through a shifting, dreamlike haze, he would see himself, a silent, shadowy form, moving as part of the pack, hunting with them under a full, luminous moon. The dreams were so intense, so deeply immersive, that he would wake in a cold sweat, his heart hammering, the strange, wild sensations lingering long after he opened his eyes. Over the next few days, the changes began to manifest beyond the realm of dreams. Mark noticed subtle yet undeniable shifts in his physical being. His hearing, always acute, became impossibly sharp. He could pick out the rustle of a squirrel in the distant undergrowth, the murmur of a stream miles away. The world of smells, once a background element, now exploded into a rich, complex tapestry of information. The damp earth, the decaying leaves, the distant scent of a deer, the faint, metallic tang of his own blood, the bright artificial lights of the cabin, the distant hum of machinery, the memory of city noise, all became a source of profound discomfort, almost painful to his heightened senses. He found himself drawn to the quiet, the darkness, the raw, untamed stillness of the deep woods. It felt less like a preference and more like an imperative, a slow biological acclimation to a new way of being. A cold, unsettling prickle of dread began to crawl beneath his skin. this wasn't just adjusting. This was something deeper, something fundamental. Mark settled into the grim routine of his enforced solitude, the cabin becoming both a refuge and a cage. He spent his days meticulously organizing his dwindling possessions, cleaning his weapons with a practiced, almost ritualistic care. Each item, a hunting knife, a spare magazine, a worn pair of binoculars, felt like an artifact from a past life, a life that now seemed impossibly distant, almost unreal. He avoided any contact with the outside world, his days blending into a seamless, quiet continuum, punctuated only by the rising and setting of the sun and the soft whispers of the wind through the pines. He had become, truly, an echo in the wilderness. Caleb, in his human form, would occasionally visit. Their meetings were always brief, conducted with a quiet dignity that transcended mere words. Caleb would update Mark on the situation in the forest. The farmers, still reeling from the terrifying encounter, had kept their distance, their fear a potent, fragile barrier. The pack was slowly, carefully, re-establishing their boundaries, resuming the ancient rhythm of their lives. Mark had become more than just a mediator to them. He was a living symbol of a difficult, fragile compromise, a bridge built of sacrifice and understanding between two disparate worlds. Then came the morning that shattered his last vestiges of human normalcy. While meticulously cleaning his neck, a daily ritual ingrained from years of field hygiene, Mark paused. He examined the deep scratches he had sustained during the battle, the wounds that had burned and throbbed for days. Now, barely a week later, they were gone. The skin was impossibly smooth, flawless, as if no injury had ever occurred. There were no scars, no lingering discoloration, not even the faint silvery sheen of newly healed tissue. It was as if his flesh had simply knitted itself back together, faster and more perfectly than any human wound healed. A cold dread, far deeper than any fear he had known, coiled in his gut. His body was reacting in ways it shouldn't. He moved to the small, dusty mirror propped on a shelf in the corner of his cabin, its surface clouded with years of neglect. He cautiously lifted the collar of his worn flannel shirt, craning his neck to examine the spot where the deepest scratch had been, at the base of his neck, just behind his left ear. The dim, weak light filtering through the cabin window struggled to penetrate the gloom. And then he saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible patch, but undeniably there. A delicate, soft, undeniably distinct strip of coarse, grayish-black fur. It was barely a quarter of an inch long, blended almost perfectly with the shadows of his hair. But it was there. Mark's breath hitched in his throat. His fingers, trembling now, reached up and brushed against the patch. It was warm, impossibly soft, unmistakably alive. He stared at his reflection, at the sliver of gray fur, at the now unsettling brightness in his own eyes. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a curse from some ancient tale. This was physical, biological, real, the impossibly fast healing, the heightened senses, the vivid wild dreams. It all clicked into place with a horrifying crystalline clarity. His wounds, received in the terrible night of choice, had not healed as human wounds. His body, in its own silent, profound way, had begun to change, to assimilate, to adapt to the new species he had chosen to protect. The silent, cold truth of his choice settled over him, a crushing, undeniable weight. He wasn't merely an outcast, an ally, a mediator. He was becoming one of them. Not by ritual, not by legend, not by a conscious act of will, but as a direct biological consequence of his immersion, of his presence on the precipice between two worlds. The transformation had begun. He closed his eyes, drawing a deep, shuddering breath, the air filling his lungs with a scent of pine and damp earth that was now impossibly sharp, impossibly vital. And as he exhaled, a primal strength, ancient and untamed, stirred deep within him, a silent, terrifying awakening in the heart of the Maine woods. Mark Downey, the hunter, the problem solver, was gone. In his place, something new, something ancient, was beginning to stir.